So you know how people will say, oh, there's two kinds of people in this world, people who get this and people who don't. So my version of this is something that I've noticed, and it's kind of like my own little folk theory, but it holds true. Like I found that it tracks in so many situations. So I'd love to just share it with you and let me know if this resonates at all, because it really ties into what I've been discussing recently too, in regards to what's happening with some of the directions in AI and AI assisted everything. So it goes like this. Basically, there are people who have mental pictures and people who don't. Now, this is an actual phenomenon. It has legitimate scientific names. It's called aphantasia. Phantasia, of course, being an older term for the faculty of visualization. Now, basically, and we've been seeing more of this recently online in some online discussions. Some people just legitimately don't experience mental pictures. They have a very hard time on the extreme end of not being able to visualize internally, like closing our eyes, trying to visualize anything. And so maybe they have less dreams as well. Like the visual faculty is not wired in the same way, so to speak. Whereas on the other extreme, you have highly visual people. I'm definitely much closer to that extreme, where you may have like a lot of lucid dreams. You have all kinds of internal mental pictures. And it can include things like synesthesia, where you're also like seeing and hearing colors and sounds, for example, that are kind of like super added onto phenomena or super added onto qualia, as it were. So I just find that is kind of a fascinating distinction, because it seems to align with the way people with a lot of relationships to the external world. So if you're really strong on, let's call it phantasia, let's call it the mental pictures, the faculty of imagination, really. I don't like the associations that has for some people with like, oh, it's imagine so it's imaginary, right? It has to do, it's like childish, it's like fantasy or something. The imagination is like a really like robust way of describing this ability. It's huge. It's actually behind a lot of our cognition. So our thought processes are not actually necessarily dependent on discursive language as such. Discursive symbology is not intrinsically the so-called language of thought. Okay, that's been falsified. So where I was going with this is that um, I feel like for a lot of people who don't have mental pictures and don't have much in that capacity, there is a tendency to like need things to like play out in physical in order to cognize them, in order to think about them, in order to bring certain pieces of logic together. So it's almost the opposite of having an intuitionist approach or an intuitionist orientation, which is very much tied to the faculty of imagination. So, on the other hand, for people who are already strong in intuition and this imaginative faculty, it's very natural and very spontaneous to quickly see the relations, the logical relations of possibilities before needing to see them in physical, so to speak. So, have you also noticed this? Just let me know. And I think it's a spectrum too, so it's not going to be like hard black and white. A lot of people probably do fall somewhere in the middle, just like the statistical bell curves, but the extremes are worth noting. And on the other extreme of this lack of internal synthesis, or this ability for an internal synthesis is which I would call it. It's so you've got really low intuition, really low on the imaginative faculty, and you're gonna need to like things need to be spelled out like sequentially. Like so, language is the perfect tool for doing this because it's a unique medium for bridging the internal with the external, because it's so discrete and literally a communicative property, so you can exchange it amongst others. It's like the perfect intersubjective tool. And so that's why like our society has grown and developed so much on that basis. So language is perfect for 3D, right? It's like sequential, it's linear, it's step by step, and it kind of like it it brings logical relations into the physical environment in a way that intuition and the imaginative faculty does not. So I don't want to further try to like make these sound like they're like opposing paradigms in some sense. Like that's actually not what I would do here. But in the aspect of how we are using these faculties to relate to the external world is more what I'm trying to emphasize. A lot of technologies have been introduced, I think, primarily, like, I think there's a high relation between their invention, their development, and a lack of internal synthesis a priori, which means being able to see the logical relations and consequences before needing to create something in physical. Does that make sense? So let me know what you guys think. Now, where this also can go on the extreme of the imaginative faculty, which I might even call it's more like the a faculty of intuition, because intuition is an ability to synthesize a priori, which means you don't need something to be playing out in the physical world in order to cognize it, in order to understand it. And so the really an extreme or like a highly developed, I guess I would say, mode of this dimension would be an example like what we call telepathy. Because in that case, we are it's an extreme of reception, and I don't even want to call it information because information really does belong to this linguistic sequential kind of discrete exchangeable model of how we interact, whereas moving it into the other spectrum is drawing more upon energetic relations, which we definitely don't obviously have the language for really talking about. We're really using language still in these metaphoric ways to try to conceive what might be happening there. But I just think that's really fascinating to think about because this is kind of an interesting spectrum. Like these, I don't want to pose them as like opposites or antagonists in any way. Um, they may be a type of polarity though in terms of how we relate to the external versus the internal. But you guys, this if this sounds obvious, I want you to like dig in deeper and look broader because this actually ties in so many things. There's so many consequences or phenomena that this can actually explain when you really like apply it. For example, as I've said, like the development of certain kinds of technologies based on a certain inability to transcend mere discursive forms of representation, discursive forms of visibility that need to be visible in the 3D world. And on the other hand, being receptive enough or having such an ability for a priori synthesis. That's what we'll call intuition. Okay, it comes from Kant. It tracks, and being able to receive other modalities, direct knowledge, and because it's fascinating that so much of our modern environment, as we've already read and heard about, we understand this critique is directed, whether intentionally, more or less unintentionally, towards the fracturing and the fragmentation and the disruption of our abilities for internal synthesis, which relates to, as I've discussed, with the internal time stream, with doing our own psychic labor, and really just disrupting all of those processes which enable us to have a priori synthesis or develop our faculty of intuition. So intuition, I guess I'm saying also, is that it's really much more, it's really even deeper than just like receiving ideas from our higher self or receiving other kinds of information. It's literally, it's at the basis of our ability to have experience at all in this realm. It's at the basis of the physiological layers of our ego, which allow us to have relations at all, which is the basis of what means that we're not just like cybernetic control loops. Because if you disabled, or if you could, like, um eliminated certain aspects of what we do a priori synthetically, well, then we would just be cybernetic behavior loops. So that's worth thinking about. And then if you really want to get technical and philosophical with this too, it tracks right along with the development in the philosophy of science towards these kinds of like logical positivist behaviorist types of orientations, where there was a lot of like direct denial of the fact that we do bring in an a priori synthesis onto our experience. We do have innate categories, we do have innate ways of like schematizing the potentials of the world before we receive them. So I just love the philosopher Kant. I once like attended like a 10-week seminar just on a 20-page section of the Critique of Pure Reason. It was awesome. And it's really, that's why this approach was so attacked, I think, afterwards, in the centuries afterwards. Um, but really, it's that we do come in with certain categories that we do apply to the experiences that we receive. So the experience of like causality, the experience of unity, the ability to perceive sequence. And what all of these things are, of course, is it's intimately tied into our reception of the projection of time, like the way that time and temporality is projected into this dimension. We The way we interface with that is through these like internal time schemas, internal cognitive ways of synthesizing what could be our experience. So that was kind of like a nice little detour. All of which is to say, you guys, let me know, like, if you experience mental pictures, if you experience this in a really strong degree. Like, do you have lucid dreams? Are you receiving clairvoyant information? um and also, if you are watching this and you don't have any of that at all, like, is it difficult for you to construct a mental picture? Does that sound confusing? So just let me know in the comments, because I think this is really a fascinating kind of discussion. Again, I think it's a spectrum. The modern world has definitely, partly intentionally, partly unintentionally, worked to disrupt our ability to have these kinds of internal a priori syntheses. So let me know what you think. Like, do you experience mental pictures? Do you not at all? Like, is it a really confusing thing to think about? On the other hand, if you receive a lot of lucid dreams, do you receive like clairvoyant imagery? Let me know where you feel like you fall on this spectrum. So as an example, I don't know if I discussed it here yet, but once I was like riding in the subway, and I guess I would call them images. They were between images and thoughts, but I had these impressions about a woman who was sitting. She was like maybe 4 or 5 seats ahead of me. And there weren't too many people on the train. There was a good handful maybe, but there was nothing visually that would indicate that anything was wrong or could go wrong. Like, I wasn't receiving visual data or cues, as we would say. But then all of a sudden, I just had this distinct feeling of like, I think it was a memory of like rabid dogs. So this, rabid. Um, Anyways, like, so about a minute or like 30 seconds after that, this woman started, like, she was just getting really volatile, and she started spitting, and she was just doing weird stuff. Like, she got up and she started spitting everywhere, and I was like, okay, I don't know what's going on, but this is my sign. Like, I'm just gonna like move. So that's what I mean. Like, that's a type of like visual reception that is a form of this kind of internal a priori synthesis. It doesn't happen in experience yet necessarily, but we're receiving the data, or we are able to cognize a certain idea. So let me know if you've had anything like that. And in general, what you think about this idea of like, this is a good way to talk about two types of people. So I'll see you in the comments.